Hello, fellow bakers, and welcome to the Breaking Bread podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Parker, and today we have the pleasure of hosting Chef Dave Palmer, member of our Baking Great Bread at Home community. He's here to share a revolutionary method for making soft, long-lasting sandwich bread. This is an episode you're not going to want to miss. Dave, welcome to the show. Why don't you start by introducing yourself to our listeners?
Hi, I'm Dave Palmer. I'm the former owner-operator chef at Dave's Cafe and Gifts in Paxton, Florida, host of the web series 50 by 50 on YouTube, and an avid baker. Most people know me online as Chef Dave Palmer.
That's quite an impressive background, Dave. Now, I understand you've been working on a recipe called Secret Wheat. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired this recipe and how you started experimenting with this method?
I primarily use Secret Wheat for sandwich bread. It looks like white bread, but it's made with 25% white whole wheat flour. I started thinking about autolyse and how it affected the extensibility of dough. Whole wheat flour is notoriously thirsty, requiring extra hydration to create a tender crumb. Note I said extra hydration, not extra liquid. So I decided to autolyse my flour just to see how it affected it. As far as I know, autolyse is only typically used in the production of sourdough bread, but I'm not sure why, because it works well with commercial yeast recipes.
Fascinating. For our listeners who might not be familiar, could you briefly explain what autolyse is and why it's typically associated with sourdough baking?
Autolyse is letting the flour and liquid of a recipe rest so that the flour has a chance to hydrate or soak up the liquid. Sourdough is usually kneaded by hand, and autolyse softens the dough, making it easier to work with. If you've ever worked with the Tongjiang method, you know that prehydrating some of the flour helps the resulting bread stay fresher for longer, and you get a softer crumb and a taller rise out of it. I'm doing a hybrid of the two and switching the order of things around just a little bit.
That's a great explanation, Dave. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of your recipe. Can you walk us through the ingredients you use?
The recipe calls for the following ingredients: bread flour, white whole wheat flour, all-purpose flour, powdered whole milk, powdered apple cider vinegar, water, instant yeast, kosher salt, sugar, and unsalted butter.
That's quite a list. I'm particularly intrigued by the powdered apple cider vinegar. Is that a common ingredient in bread baking?
It's not. It's another experimental ingredient that I've been working with. The idea is that it slightly acidifies the bread, creating an environment that is resistant to mold and bacteria growth. I'm using it as a natural preservative, basically. I live in a humid environment prone to accelerated mold and bacteria growth. You can't taste it at all, and it works.
Now, let's talk methodology. You've made some interesting changes to the typical bread making process. Can you walk us through your method step by step?
In a stand mixer, form a dough using all the flour, milk powder, vinegar powder, and warm water. Once it's fully combined, place it in an airtight container that you would use to proof in. Then put it in a warm spot like you are proofing it. I put mine in the oven on the proof setting, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, for 30 minutes. If you're doing it on the countertop at room temperature, it's probably going to take a little bit longer. When you take it out, you will immediately feel the difference in the hydration level by the texture alone. Put it back in your stand mixer and knead in your remaining ingredients one by one: yeast, salt, sugar, and finally butter. Once you reach window pane, which you should be able to do much easier now, proof it as you normally would, allow it to double in size, shape it and let it proof a second time in the bread pan you're planning to bake in, and then bake it 30 to 35 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and you will have beautifully soft sandwich bread once it completely cools, of course.
That's fascinating, Dave. You've really turned the traditional bread making process on its head. Can you explain why you hold back certain ingredients during the initial mix?
Want to get scientific with me? All right. Here's the whys of holding out the ingredients. No yeast to keep it from proofing. No salt because salt strengthens the gluten, and we want the hydration to be unhindered. No sugar because there is no yeast to feed in the dough yet. And no butter because fats and oils can cause flour to become hydrophobic. That means it'll repel water, which we don't want it to do.
This is truly groundbreaking stuff, Dave. But the real test is in the eating, right? What kind of results have you seen with this method?
Day-old bread now tastes and feels like freshly baked bread, and stays that way up to 4 or 5 days later. As an experiment, I cut a slice out of a loaf the day I made it. I ate the slice, tasted it for taste and texture, and then I bagged the rest up. 4 days later, I made sandwiches out of the rest of the loaf, and it was as if it were fresh. I feel like I have cracked the code.
Wow, bread that stays fresh for 4 to 5 days, that's incredible. Dave, you've given our listeners so much to think about and experiment with. Where can they find your full recipe if they want to try this at home?
Sure, you can find Secret Wheat at my recipe site, chefmylife.com.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and innovation with us today, Dave. I'm sure our listeners are eager to try out your secret wheat recipe.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. I look forward to seeing other people's results using my methodology.
And to our listeners, remember you can find the full transcript of this episode, along with links to Dave's recipe, on our blog at bakinggreatbread.blog. Don't forget to join our Facebook group, Baking Great Bread at Home, to discuss this episode and share your own baking experiments. Until next time, may your bread always rise, and your kitchen be filled with the delicious aroma of freshly baked bread. This is Rachel Parker, reminding you to always break bread with those you love. Happy baking!